that is the problem with connections between Teams and between Zoom, but that's something that you missed out on. So here you go. But we'll share the slides in any case afterwards, so you'll see the first ones too. And then the other part of this is specifically for operators. When an operator needs to start working, and I mean, in this case, operators from a machine like this in a manufacturing environment, but equally so an operator in a system environment, it's really everything, and we know that from security as well. It's always about the weakest link. And if we cannot secure what the weakest link is, in this case, something that has been developed by a thanklessly maintaining person in Nebraska, it's going to be a bit of a challenge. So that's also something that, in this case, the SBOMs are trying to make more transparent, provide at least an insight on what's in there, and that you know and understand if you're purchasing a piece of software or equipment, that it has to rely on this person out of Nebraska in this context. So the SBOMs have been conceptualized already more than 20 years ago as a piece of, as a concept. And it was by a number of persons from in the US, which we know very well, under the constraints of what was called the anti-IA. Today, the SBOMs are part of the CISA organization. That is the Central Information and Security, Cybersecurity Agency out of the US, which is basically a department directly under the president. So it is very high on the agenda in the US, and as a result, that's also the reason why there's quite a lot of attention on SBOMs in the US. I'll talk a little bit further about these things for the next couple of minutes, but just to give you a bit of the perspective on what you can expect for the rest of the day. So once finalizing this introduction, we'll hand it over to the colleagues from the Trusted IoT project and activities. So we'll have the rest of the morning talking about potential improvements in terms of security on the basis of partially hardware, but also partially pieces of technologies that can help. Quite an interesting set of presentations that you can expect from partners here in the room and also online. And thanks in any case also Anne for facilitating that. So we'll be doing that in any case together in the rest of the morning. And the link, I think, with SBOMs is already a bit clearer, but we'll get back to that in a second. And then the afternoon, we spent more time on trying to clarify what the Cyber Resilience Act is once the colleagues from Timelex arrive, which have been studying on this domain for quite some time. We've also asked the people from the Commission to talk about this, and they are willing to do so, but that will be for probably February, March timeframe, because at this point in time, actually, they are finalizing the final notes on the Cyber Resilience Act for it to be presented again to Parliament and to be actually agreed upon in the first quarter of next year. And then the rest of the day will be talking about the developments also of some SBOMs. Luca will guide you to developing your own first SBOM, and don't you're not expected to be a top engineer for this. However, I do know that the majority of you are top engineers, but so even then it might be a challenge. And so then finally we'll end the day with an intervention from one of our colleagues out of the US from GitHub, who will be talking about the relation on SBOMs in GitHub itself, and also how GitHub sees this further developing towards the future, being it one of the most important platforms, of course, in terms of sharing and looking into open source pieces of technologies. So a bit of perspective in terms of state of affairs of SBOM, why it's still very relevant and why it actually has simply increased in relevance. This is just one. Supply chain risk is continuously increasing. So you might remember things like SolarWinds 2020 in the heat of the moment of Corona. This was really the activity that started the US government to think, how do we manage this going forward? And it took them about 6 months to draft the executive order, which is basically a piece of legislation by the Biden administration that requires from any government agency and 3 specific departments, energy, healthcare, and then defense. For any purchase that they make, they require an SBOM. They require the piece of hardware or software to be delivered with an SBOM. And then the next one that just speeded up the whole development was Log4j. Somebody remembering this? I guess so, yeah. But it just continued, so it didn't, Medibank and Move It stayed a little bit under the radar, but it's clear that there's still many of these things happening today. The development of SBOMs is basically also caused by the continuous growth of cybersecurity trends. In this case, incidents coming from malwares, coming from something else. Spending on cybersecurity is increasing with the same magnitude as basically all of the incidents and malwares that we're seeing. And also the number of products and technologies that are being acquired. However, we have seen a shift from much more product and technology oriented buying to much more cloud and services based. And it doesn't have to surprise you since we are making this transition to the cloud, but definitely also in terms of the services being purchased. And also that has an impact, of course, in the world of these SBOM requirements, because companies, people are demanding much more about this visibility in pieces of technology. So more than 20 years ago, the original ideas about SBOMs coming actually also from the traditional industry. Also one of the reasons why we work together with Flanders Make, because many companies in the industrial domain do have an experience and know how to work with bill of materials if they're producing new pieces of technology, if they're producing new pieces of equipment. So from uncharted concept to cybersecurity cornerstones, and the change catalyst was really this presidential order in the US that basically required today SBOMs to be a necessity for the purchasing. And then what we see is that basically an ever-growing regulatory landscape, both in the US and now also in Europe, is also causing a requirement of embedding much more security into technology capabilities. And I think those of us in security, that is basically what we always have been vocalizing, that security needs to be embedded, needs to be part of the design. Security by design, privacy by design are the very necessity things that need to happen. So an ever-growing regulatory scrutiny, and therefore, where is it needed, there is secure software development, obviously, taking advantage of whatever as a service, IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, whatever's. And then the software bill of materials is just being part of that component. And then we have the different use cases. On the one hand side, there's the developers of softwares. There's the procurers of software, so basically the end users. There's the operators. We haven't talked about those yet too much. The operators, like in this case, for instance, a security incident team. Where do they see the use of an SBOM? Well, to get a better understanding about the vulnerabilities of the products that a company has been acquiring. Now, they basically have to work on the basis of, yes, we know that we have a Microsoft Exchange server running here. It's a 2007 version, but we don't really know what the potential vulnerabilities of it are. So we'll have to search that online, and then we can understand, okay, these are the different sets of vulnerabilities. So now we know how to work with that. If this is automated on the basis of the ledger that I showed you just before, it becomes much easier for security operations centers and incident responders to understand where this is coming from and how they need to operate. So therefore, incident response teams. But also regulators, and that's partially also the reasoning for the Commission, the European Commission in this case, because many products arrive in Europe with quite a lot of security holes in there. We all know that. That's part of the things that we are doing, is trying to investigate those things. And how can Europe and any basically other nation or groups of nations, nation states, try to defend themselves against those potential vulnerabilities? That is by putting out regulatory requirements, of course. So in the future, once the Cyber Resilience Act gets out, and you'll know more about that later on, this will be one of the requirements. But you can also see it happening towards the near future, litigation, deferral of responsibilities. So let's say that you're being hacked, and let's say that you've asked your vendor for an SBOM, and in this SBOM, it's not very clear that there's a vulnerability in the system or in the software that the vendor has provided. Is that maybe a mechanism that you can start to go after him and say, well, listen, you didn't provide any indication of this vulnerability. It's there, we've seen it. So here we are now relying on you to help us out in clearing up this mess, also from a financial perspective, of course. Maybe some of the topics that we can talk about later on this afternoon together with the legal guys. I'm sure you're familiar with the Gartner hype cycles. Anybody in technology is a bit aware of this. And as you can see, we are really now almost at the top of the hype cycle. That's where the software bill of materials is. Is that a good thing? Yes, it is, because it's therefore the Gartner hype cycle is being used by many enterprises. And so definitely in the US, SBOM over the last 2 years has been a hype on the positive and the negative side in any case. So it gets on the agenda in any case of many companies that are purchasing software and technologies. Is it a bad thing as well? Yes, of course, because it's still a hype, meaning that it still needs to be implemented into organizations, and the real uses of SBOMs really still need to have to be shown and have to be much more clear. And we'll talk about that later on. So quickly, today's landscape on cybersecurity looks a bit like a very old cockpit of an airplane. If you want to manage cybersecurity, you have to know almost everything. And there's so many different monitors that you have to follow, all sorts of incidents coming in. There's so many different levers and switches and things that you really have to be a super cybersecurity engineer to know where to steer to. And of course, there's not too many out there today that can do that. So we need to increase this facility to reduce the complexity of cybersecurity. And therefore also providing much more transparency. Another big challenge is what's fake, what's real. And of course, you understand that from the images and from deepfakes and from pieces of images which are being created by AI engines, Gen AI. But the same can be true also for instance, pieces of software code and what is real and where is it coming from. So providing a ledger and then maybe also securing the ledger is one of the things that we would be looking for. You're all working on devices and on improving those devices. Those are being put on the edge. In this case, it's a pretty advanced piece of automotive that has so many different IoT components in there that everything will fail at some point in time, or at least some components will fail. So therefore, we need to further enhance these things as well, so that we at least know that we can protect them. And when we put that into an industrial context, like here today with Flanders Make, but also towards some of the IoT SBOM users, we need to make sure that those digital twins are also secured enough. And I talked about the security landscape, but equally so from the perspective of zero trust. And as we indicated, talking a little bit about zero trust, who's familiar with zero trust? Okay, the majority here, that's a good thing. So I call this usually, is it really putting old wine into new bottles? Question mark. And I think to a large extent from most of us, it is the case. However, I think we can also see it from a positive side, because there where maybe security for many people was before a pure binary thing, yes, it's secure, it's not secure, at least the zero trust helps us today in making more gradual improvements in cybersecurity. And I think also here, using the many different components to help people understand why there's a complexity and why they should not simply trust anything that they receive is an improvement. And I think that's also the relation to the SBOMs, because in this case as well, we need to provide more transparency and more clarity on what's really inside. And I hope You will be seeing that later on as well, and we'll see that also together with some of the other presentations in the morning. The complexity is that it needs to be organized as a program inside of a company that's developing tools and technologies, as well as it needs to be organized as a program inside the company that's receiving SBOMs. So it becomes more and more of a management challenge as well. And some companies have seen that it's not only about pure technology, it's not only about purchasing a piece of equipment or software. What you do with the SBOMs once you get access to them. So the process has to be defined on how to integrate that and how to consider that in a broader perspective. And it's not the end. So SBOMs have been required now since about 2 years in the US. They will be required in Europe in a couple of months/years. But it's an intermediate process. Because in the end, what do we want to achieve also as cybersecurity professionals? We want to make sure that there is this thing by design. And that's not only there's the thought of it by design, but that it's also being exposed to the outside world. So more transparency will be required. And we see the first aspects of this already happening in the US. And, you know, when it starts to rain in the US, then it's probably a storm over here in Europe. And so that's also what you can expect. So continuously, the legal policy makers on both sides of the pond will be investigating and learning from each other on how to further improve. And so in this case, there is already this development going from SBOMs to secure software development frameworks, the SSDF. And so what's now being required, since I think the draft version is out now since about a month, and will be implemented again in an executive order in the US early next year, is what they call a secure software development attestation form. It's nothing more than basically a form where any software vendor describes, these are my vulnerabilities, and this is where I say that we actually have been doing a secure development process and program. And we actually show you both in terms of the different groups, how we have prepared the organization, how do we protect the software, how do we produce well-secured software, and how we respond to vulnerabilities. So those 4 main groups, which then need to be delivered in practices. And so the attestation form needs to be documented on the basis of these different practices. So it's not over yet, meaning that the intermediate step of using basically an SBOM is just a first step in the learning curve of how any organization will need to start adopting itself towards it. And they made it a little bit further clear. When a federal agency, a purchaser requires software or a product containing software, the agency should receive attestation from the software producer that the software development complies with government-specified secure software development practices. So it cannot be very much clearer than this, I guess. It's also becoming a bit more challenging because of the expertise and experiences that have now been learned in the US on developing and applying SBOMs. So there's also much more criticism being heard. For instance, what to do with it when you get it, I think is the real question. So you get an SBOM, what do you do with it? Not too many people that really have an answer to it yet. We think that we can steer some companies to that perspective. SBOMs are for some companies a goal in itself, but it's not really, because it's part of the software supply chain security concept. So it's really a component there, but it's not the end goal. Component deliveries are not as clear as most organizations would like to think. I think many of the SBOMs that you can see today are just so high level that you're still having difficulties in implementing them correctly and to understand where potentially issues are. And if even we would implement them, the ones that we create, we also see quite a lot of false positives coming out because they are making interdependencies which are outdated, or where basically also the vulnerabilities have already in the meantime been resolved, or they're not really that big a deal types of vulnerabilities. So different gradations in terms of severities of issues will be further popping up. And then how to deal with identified vulnerabilities. So it's really about the integration of this that requires a program in itself. So, and I'll end up with a couple of these things, and then I'll hand it over to Anne to introduce us a little bit more about the trusted IoT. So I think there's been great expectations on the SBOMs that a product is composed of many different components and many different subcomponents and third subcomponents, but it's a bit more complicated than this. And if we immediately go to the next one, you'll see that there are different components and there's subcomponents which have different other types of links with different types of vulnerabilities being related to them. So the chain is harder and complexer to maintain and to manage than it would appear on a very first level. Taking it to Europe, and just to give you a bit of an impression on what to expect later on. So there is this thing called the Cyber Resilience Act. Who knows? Okay, about half of the room here. It is a piece of legislation that was released in its first version about a year ago, so 2022. And like many of the regulations, there's the document, 80 pages, describing the full mumbo jumbo in legal terms that our colleagues from Timex will be talking about later on. But the more interesting things are in the annexes. And so here you can already see how this basically represents. So 90% of the products can be done through self-assessments. Things like word processing software, smart speakers, hard drives, and so forth. And the Commission will start to focus much more on the critical types of instruments, things which arrive in, for instance, energy, banking, those pieces of software, but also, as they put it themselves, security pieces of software, firewalls, password managers, or in other senses, secure elements. We'll be talking about some of those later on. Those will be requiring much more of this description. And making it a little bit further clear, so as I mentioned, the main document is the legal mumbo jumbo. For us as more technical experts, I would say the interest is in the annexes, Annex 1 through 4 or 5 in this case. This is where there's specific mentionings of the SBOMs. So manufacturers of the product with digital elements shall include by drawing up a software or bill of materials in a commonly used and machine-readable format, covering at the very least, the top-level dependencies of the product. Now, what this year, since September 22 up until today, has been about is really about what are the small nitty-gritty things on in these texts that need to be adopted and that need to be much more useful for manufacturers. And what we then see is that there's many European manufacturers which are pushing the brake in such a way that they, of course, don't want this because it requires a lot of more attention and work for them. But also, very strangely, that somehow they don't really want to further secure their products. So I think that's really a key message from the things that we've learned over the last year and a half working on the SBOM activities. So I'll probably leave it to a couple of final things here. What we do with IIoTSBOM is trying to make this whole program a bit clearer, trying to identify how it needs to be done and how companies need to be helped in understanding why it's needed, why it's there, and how to organize it, because it becomes much more complex, as you will see and understand. One of the things that we'll be doing more in the coming year, so stay tuned on this, is showcasing some tool sets. I think, and a very easy count the last couple of weeks, we came up with about 350 different pieces of technologies, tools that can help you with SBOMs. So it becomes less and less clear for any company or producer of software on what technology to buy. So we'll be providing some more clarity and indications on doing that. What we can also do is we have a program together also with Flanders Make, where we can improve this as a service to companies, sponsored and supported by the European Commission. So with Digitalis, we have a European Digital Innovation Hub where we can actually implement the SBOMs together with the manufacturers at a very, let's say, cost sensitive pricing model. Almost free, but I didn't want to say that. And so a couple of the things that we have scheduled for still this year is a webinar with some of the SBOM consumers that we know from Europe. Infrabel here in Belgium has included it as part of its NIST requirements and NIS2 requirements, so which is demanding much more transparency also in the supply chain for critical infrastructure operators like Infrabel. So they've included the procurement of SBOMs into their domain, and so we'll be learning together with some other companies a bit about the uses of SBOM consumers in this case, and then a couple of other topics that we foresee. Okay, so I'll leave it with this. Thanks in any case for joining in. I'll hand it over now to Anne to give a couple of words of introduction on the second part of this morning.